Hey there, welcome. We're going to dive into a pretty wild story today, all based on a historical text. It's about how the early Christian church went through some major changes. Some you might not expect.
Okay, think about your favorite game. Could be a video game, board game, anything. Now what if, over a super long time, the rules started changing? Like, so much that if the original player saw it today, they wouldn't even recognize it. Well, the text we're looking at today asks kind of the same question, but about the early church. So yeah, let's get into it.
So where does this all start? Well, according to this source, it begins with a warning, a prophecy even. The author points to one of the early apostles, a guy named Paul, who apparently saw that some big shifts were on the horizon for the church.
And here it is. The source zeroes in on this specific verse from the Bible. The claim here is that this was basically a prediction, a heads up that something called a great apostasy was going to happen.
Apostasy sounds like a big word, right? But all it really means is a falling away, like drifting away from the original rules and beliefs. And the key thing the author wants us to get is that this falling away wasn't a surprise. According to them, it was predicted from the very beginning.
Okay, so if this change was predicted, how did it actually happen? Well, according to this text, it all kicked off when the church started teaming up with some very powerful people, like kings and emperors.
The author breaks it down into like 4 steps. You see, at first, Christians were being persecuted, right? But then, suddenly, they found friends in high places. We're talking palaces and kings. And that, the text says, is when things started to change. Simple faith got swapped out for all the fancy stuff you'd see with royalty. And then, to get even more people on board, some old pagan customs and ideas got mixed in with Christian beliefs.
And this combination, this big mix-up, led to what the author calls a gigantic system of false religion. The biggest change? The text argues that one single person, the Pope, was put in charge of everything, becoming the supreme leader. And the author's whole point is that you'll never find a role like that described in the original rulebook, the Bible.
All right, so that's the big picture. But what did these changes actually look like, day to day? Well, the source gives us a couple of really specific examples of how the rules got tweaked.
First up, images. The text claims that to make new people feel more comfortable, people who were used to praying to statues and idols, the church started allowing the worship of images and relics. But wait, what about the rule against that? Well, the author claims that the second commandment, the one that says, don't worship images, was just removed from the version taught to the people.
And here's the other huge one the text points out. Look at this comparison. On the left, you have the original rule from the 4th commandment. The 7th day, Saturday, is the day of rest, the Sabbath. But on the right, you see the new practice. The text argues that the church moved the day of worship to Sunday, which was known as the Venerable Day of the Sun, to make it easier for pagans who worshipped the sun to join. So this all begs a really big question, right? If these huge changes weren't actually in the Bible, how did this happen? How did no one just stand up and say, hey, wait a minute, that's not in the rule book?
Well, the answer this author gives is kind of shocking. They claim the Bible itself was basically put in chains. The text says the church leadership banned ordinary people from reading it. They weren't even allowed to have one in their own homes. The rulebook itself was taken away. But why? Why would you hide the one book that has all the original instructions? It seems crazy, but according to this author, there was a very specific reason for it. It really all boils down to one word: control. The source argues that if people read the Bible for themselves, they'd see that all these new ceremonies and rules weren't in there. They'd realize the Pope's authority wasn't what it was claimed to be. By keeping the Bible away, the priests and leaders could interpret it however they wanted to keep their own power. It's that simple. So let's recap. According to this text, you've got a new leader, new rules, and the original rulebook is hidden away. What happens next? Well, the period that followed is described by the author as literally the Dark Ages. This quote just says it all, doesn't it? The noon of the papacy was the midnight of the world. What a powerful image. It means that while the power of the Pope was shining its brightest, like the sun at noon, the rest of the world was plunged into a moral and intellectual darkness, like the dead of night. And the source paints a pretty bleak picture of this era. It claims that people's faith got transferred from God to the Pope, that you could just buy forgiveness with money. that there was this terrifying thing called the Inquisition to punish anyone who didn't go along with the new system. The text argues that with the real rules set aside and the rulebook locked up, progress in learning, arts, you name it, it just ground to a halt for centuries.
And really, this is the author's bottom line. The main point of this whole story, from this text's point of view, is that everything went off the rails the moment the Word of God, the Bible, was banished.
So that brings us back to the question the author really wants us to think about, and it goes way beyond just history. Let's go back to that game we talked about at the start. What happens to any group, any project, any team when people lose access to their primary rulebook? It's something to think about. Thanks so much for tuning in to this explainer.